It's good to be with you all, and it's actually great to be back on these grounds here. I went to law school over there, and you're talking about midterm tests and all that. Brings back really bad memories of UVA. The most fun I had playing, doing anything here was actually I was on the rugby team. We played football in undergraduate and rugby on the when I was in law school, which was the most fun of all sports I played. There's 15 aside and only one referee. And anybody play rugby here? No rugby players. All right. Well, have you been to a rugby party? All right. You understand why it's added fun off the field as well. At any rate, I was asked to come and speak about my book that I've written, What Washington Can Learn from the World of Sports. And I'll talk about the book and some of the applicable sports analogies or principles and how they apply to governance. And then I want to open it up to questions, hear what you all may have to observe, or comments, questions, insults that you may have. When you think of Washington, D.C., and our U.S. federal government, there's hardly anything that anybody's cheering about that's coming out of Washington. It's about the opposite of that. But in sports, people love their sports teams. They love their high school teams. They love their college teams. They love their pro teams. And I was thinking in writing this book, all right, what are the characteristics or the attributes or the principles of sports that would be applicable to governance? And a lot of it was a reflection of growing up in the world of sports. My father was a football coach, and we moved all over the country, and I was on the sidelines, and I was at training camp, and I played sports myself. And looking back at it, probably the overarching principle that you learn from sports is on those teams, there are players from all over the country, different races, different religions, different ethnicities, and none of that mattered. All that mattered was, can that guy help your team win? Can he block, tackle, punt, pass, or kick? And everyone gets to play equally on a level playing field, and it's a meritocracy where everyone has that equal opportunity to compete and succeed. And that's what we should aspire to in our society, where everyone has that equal opportunity, not equal results, but equal opportunity. Indeed, if we're up to Washington, they take, say, the Pittsburgh Steelers. They've won 6 Super Bowl championships. And the folks in Washington would say, all right, well, gosh, look at these poor Detroit Lions. You know, they've never even made it to a Super Bowl. Let's just give them one of those trophies. No, that's wrong. You got to earn your success on that level playing field. The other attributes of sports that I think are really important for governance is accountability, measurements, the concepts of competitiveness, making sure our states or our country are more competitive, measure. What gets measured gets better. You don't watch a basketball game and try to guess what the score of it is. There's a scoreboard. There needs to be measurement. There's also team and personal responsibility, and there's also sportsmanship. All of these sort of things seem to be missing in the world of politics these days. Now, the book on what Washington can learn from the world of sports, all these things about preparation and teamwork, and these ideas are all in it, and not having a government redistributing success from one to others who haven't earned that success. A lot of folks in looking at our country these days think it's on the decline. Susan and our daughter, oldest daughter, who graduated from across the mountain at JMU, a lot of kids graduating these days are having a hard time finding good jobs. She's gotten a job, but a lot of her friends, just like she, had a hard time finding work. And that's part of weak, declining economy in our country. And some folks say, well, this is the way it has to be. Well, no, it isn't. And I firmly believe it's time for an American comeback. And a comeback based on certain principles. I call them common sense Jeffersonian conservative principles. It's wonderful. I can say that here and everyone appreciates it. When I talk about Jeffersonian conservative principles at Blacksburg, they kind of sneer at it with it. But those principles do apply. Now, there's a lot of questions of what the federal government is doing, and I write in my book, the federal government ought to be soberly focused, like a good sports team, on its specific responsibilities. There are enumerated responsibilities. Number one is national defense, but not be meddling and dictating and and manipulating our lives like a drunken, bloated nanny spending on somebody else's credit card. And in my view is that's the way the federal government ought to be operating. Now, I was actually speaking at St. Paul's College, which is a historically black college in Virginia, and it was right before my book came out. And there were some football players there and a few football coaches. And I asked one of the football coaches, I said, "Hey, coach, y'all ever punt on first down?" And he said, "Nah, you never punt on first down." I said, "Perfect. That's a title in a chapter in my book that's just coming out in 2 weeks." And if you look at energy policy in our country, we have been punting on first down since the 1970s. This is before many of you, all of y'all, it looks like, were born. Before you were born in the early 70s, OPEC, you've heard of OPEC, they started manipulating production and prices. And so all folks were saying, oh, we just can't be so dependent on foreign sources of oil. And of course, we've become more and more dependent. And so we have been punting on first down constantly insofar as energy policy in this country. In fact, if you look at the energy policy coming out of Washington, everything is counterproductive for our resources. Now, you know, sports teams, the fans all have those big fingers. We're number one. They're all happy to be number one. Well, you know, when it comes to energy policy or energy resources in our country, America's number one in the world when it comes to energy resources, thanks to our plentiful coal, as well as good sources and supplies of natural gas as well as oil. Russia's number 2 and the Saudis are number 3. Most countries would consider these resources to be a blessing. Our government looks at these resources as a curse. And so what I have in my book is a winning American energy game plan that is one that is very positive, constructive, and a way for America to have that strategic American energy independence. First, you have to start off with practical common sense conservation. There are surface treatments, there are new technologies, maybe nanotechnology where you have lighter, stronger materials that do not need as much propulsion, so they don't need as much energy to move them. It may be nanotech-enhanced lithium-ion batteries. There's just a lot of ideas that make a lot of sense. In fact, what I talk about is here at the University of Virginia. This is wonderful. I could give these examples here. When we were touring the UVA campus, not the campus, the grounds and the dorms, they said, well, here are the new dorms and here are the old dorms. Well, the new dorms are about 50 years old, but they're still called the new dorms because they're newer than the old dorms. Well, if you're going to put in, say, heating, it would be nice to have cooling in the old dorms, which of course they don't. For the undergrads, all know that wonderful sweaty time in there. But if you're actually putting in systems, say heating or cooling or illumination systems that save money as far as the operations of those buildings, and look at the life cycle cost of the buildings, and if you're saving money, say it breaks even in 5 years or 6 years, and you look at the life cycle cost of it, this is saving the taxpayers money. That it would apply not just to dormitories or buildings at colleges, but it would apply to courthouses, prisons, hospitals, buildings that are going to be around for 50 years plus. And so it just makes good sense to save the taxpayers money by using these more innovative conservation approaches, because we waste too much energy. We waste water, we waste food, we waste electricity in this country. And so these ideas make a great deal of sense. The other aspect of energy that makes sense is clean coal technology. If you care about affordable electricity, the most affordable electricity are in states that are generating electricity predominantly by either hydroelectric or by coal. Now, your Oregon uses hydroelectric, and they have very good rates, low rates. Now, you're not going to get hydroelectric because that's mostly a function of terrain. That's mostly going to be in the northwestern part of the United States. We don't have the rivers or terrain of the Columbia River, the Snake River, and so forth of out west, but all of us can use clean coal technology for affordable electricity. Now, some folks will say, oh, well, who cares about affordable electricity? Let's pay 3 times as much and have intermittent wind power. Well, I'll tell you, as governor, I'd go up to New York City and recruit businesses to Virginia. And compared to the rates they pay in Connecticut and New York and New Jersey, I would tell these folks our rates are almost free. They're easily half of what they pay there. And for technology companies that use a lot of electricity, they say they need perfect power. No blips, no surges, no sags, and it needs to be affordable. And for semiconductor fabs or these data storage facilities or many others, perfect and affordable electricity matters a great deal, and coal, by every measurement, whether it's affordability, jobs, or American, is very important, and we need to cleanly and creatively use our coal. Other solutions are coal can be liquefied or it can be gasified. In South Africa, for many, many years, they've been using liquefied coal. Every jet flying out of the airport in Johannesburg is on a coal syn-fuel mixture. China's building about a dozen of these coal-to-liquid facilities, and that can be an option as well. Gas and oil are part of the solution. The other's advanced nuclear for baseload electricity. And the problem we have for our country in nuclear is that every one of the 104 nuclear sites or nuclear reactors are also high-level radioactive waste sites because the administration in Washington has shut down the National Repository in Yucca Mountain, Nevada. Now, my view is we can learn from others. And I know this may be blasphemous to say this, but we can actually learn from the French when it comes to nuclear. What they do is they recycle. They reprocess their spent fuel. It's a much more efficient, less dangerous approach than what we have. And the reason why don't we do that? This is from the days of Jimmy Carter when he was president, who stopped recycling of spent fuel. Now what the French do, they recycle it, they vitrify it, they encase it in glass, and it's a much better approach than what we take. And my view is, I know darn well that if the French can do it, so can Americans. And so we ought to allow that reprocessing here in our country. The point of all of this is whether it's batteries, whether it's compressed natural gas, whether it's clean coal technology, whether it's practical common sense conservation, there's no single silver bullet. We need silver buckshot as far as the diversity of supply that we need in our country. And the only thing holding us back really is not our resources, it's not the creativity of the American people. What's holding us back is a lack of political will in Washington to unleash those resources and creativity for our country. In fact, what you see, they come up with these cap and trade schemes, which would cause skyrocketing electricity costs. One of the worst things are the latest out of Washington, and I guess some of you may have studied the case Massachusetts versus EPA, where EPA has now said they're going to regulate CO2. And by regulating CO2, what we'll end up with is skyrocketing electricity prices, higher fuel prices, and higher food prices. All of this to supposedly change the temperature of the Earth by a fraction of 1 degree 50 years from now. Now, they can't accurately predict the weather 10 days from now, much less 50 years from now. And on top of this, regulations that'll be burdening American small businesses and families is the fact that no other country in the world is going to impose this on their citizens. The central planners in Beijing, China, they want to improve the quality of life of their citizens. They're not going to do this. India's not going to do it. Brazil, Russia, no other country is going to do it. So to impose this burden on America is in effect economic unilateral disarmament, and it makes our country less competitive for investment and jobs, especially where those energy costs are a major factor in the cost of doing business. Another chapter I have is no one pays to watch officials officiate. You don't go to a basketball game or football game or any game to watch the zebras. You want to see the teams compete. But you have in our country the folks in Washington being those officials officiating and trying to dictate to us not just the energy we use, but how much income we can have, or even our health care. If you look at this convoluted new experiment, massive experiment in health care, is here you have the federal government telling us what to do, telling us what kind of insurance we ought to have. We ought to be going the exact opposite way with what are called health savings accounts, where individuals own their own accounts, and they can take it from job to job and not be beholden to employers or the government. What we need is more freedom. We need more opportunity. We need more personal responsibility as principles that guide our country rather than dictates, mandates, and fostering a dependency on the government. Another chapter I have it's called What Gets Measured Gets Better. Those words actually came from the president of George Mason University when I was governor. We were on the lawn, and I was trying to put in some standards of measurement for colleges and universities. And he said, well, you know, Governor, what gets measured gets better. And that's very true. If you don't measure something, then it's standards or accountability, you'll not have it. And in education, it's absolutely essential that we measure. Are young people learning how to read and write and speak the English language? Are they learning higher levels of math and science? Are they learning economics in the history of Virginia and America and major civilizations of the world? And that's why you have to have measurement. And I actually argue we ought to get more veterans teaching. My father had a team they called Over the Hill Gang, and he liked veterans. And I actually used Susan's father, though, as an example. He was a 20-year, he had 20 years of service and 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. And after those 20 years, he went to Piedmont Community College here in Charlottesville and started the first computer lab. And so he brought those experiences and that discipline and the punctuality and expectations you find in the Marines to his students, and for decades those students were learning computers and so forth. And I think we ought to be getting more veterans as they leave the armed services in schools. Another chapter I call is the home field advantage, and I talk about the Minnesota Twins and their Homer Hankies, and they had this really terrible stadium they lost this year, but they would win the World Series winning only games at home. They'd always lose on the road, but they'd win at home. The Denver Broncos and all the Denver teams, because it's a mile high, have a great home field advantage because other teams are not accustomed to that altitude. Then there's other teams that'll be teams that have indoor stadiums and they're running on artificial turf, and they'll have different players than one that play on natural turf. The point is there's that home field advantage. Now, the home field advantage that you see in sports is really the concept of federalism or localism that's in our Constitution, that the states are laboratories of democracy, and the states ought to determine what's best for their states, reflecting the values and the ambitions of the people in their states. And states have all sorts of different ideas. You take this healthcare situation. Years ago, Tennessee tried something called TennCare, and they said, oh, this is the future of healthcare. And it ended up being a disaster and nearly bankrupt an otherwise really well-run state of Tennessee. Then Massachusetts has put in this law. No other state wanted to emulate or copy what Massachusetts did. Now, what has Congress done? It's imposed a Massachusetts disaster on our whole country. Now, you have a state like Indiana where Governor Daniels is putting in health savings accounts. Washington State is covering home health care, which can be a much less expensive approach. The point is let the states decide what's the best idea for them. And ideas that work, you'll say, well, you know, that's a good idea. That worked in Kentucky. That might be able to work here in Virginia. Or they did something in Texas, and they say, well, Texas does things their own way. Here's a way we could adapt it to the laws in our Constitution, say, in Virginia. And that's the way, that's the beauty of our system, in that home field advantage, and there really is no place like home. When I was governor, we cut taxes and did a lot of different things to make Virginia more attractive. For example, one of the big selling points for Virginia is that we have right-to-work laws. A right-to-work law is pretty simple, and it simply states that no man or woman shall be compelled to join a union as a condition of work or of employment. We're in a minority of states that have this law. I actually think it's a matter of personal freedom. I don't think anybody ought to be forced to join a union as a condition of employment. However, most of the states have what are called closed shop rules. But we're in Virginia, and we're the furthest state north on the eastern seaboard with the right-to-work law. That gave us a great competitive advantage in getting businesses to come to Virginia. Even if they were unionized businesses, they had better labor union relations because of a right-to-work law that the unions actually have to do a good job in keeping those union members paying those dues because they didn't have to if they didn't feel that they were getting their money's worth. Now, Some states have a different point of view on it, but in time after time, whether you look at welfare reform, education standards, economic development, criminal justice, we abolished the lenient, dishonest parole system in Virginia, and our crime rates dropped. The rapists weren't getting out after 3 years, after serving a fifth of their sentence. And guess what? Crime rates dropped. They weren't lurking in a parking garage because they were serving 14 years rather than 3. And some other states have a different approach. Virginia, we also put in a concealed carry law, where law-abiding citizens can get a concealed carry permit. Everyone said, oh gosh, you do this, it's going to turn out like Tombstone, Arizona, and a shootout at the OK Corral. And the reality is law-abiding citizens are simply protecting themselves and their families. And you look at a place like the District of Columbia or Maryland, their crime rates are much higher than ours in Virginia. They're more lenient. Citizens don't have those same Second Amendment personal rights of self-defense that we have in Virginia, and therefore criminals don't have to worry about as much whether or not a victim is able to defend themselves. And so Maryland may want to do whatever they want to do, but allow us in Virginia to experiment this way, and it's been very beneficial. Finally, let me bring this on, since we have a lot of lawyers here. I have a chapter in the book entitled, When Umpires Can't Be Trusted, Everyone Loses. And this has to do with judges. Whenever you see these scandals in sports where you have officials making up the rules or being unfair in their judging, it ruins the integrity of the game. And you see it in the Olympics and you saw it in the NBA. The same applies really in jurisprudence, in that laws are to be made by the legislative branch. You've all learned this years ago. Laws are not to be made by unelected judges who are appointed for life. And too often you see judges putting in their own personal views, notwithstanding what the law is passed by the legislative branch, whether it's Congress or whether it's a state legislature. And that's dangerous, because you ought to have that integrity. In sports, I mean, there's been some really foolish rules. They enforce it the way they are, and then they change the rules later. That's the way it's done. You can say, gosh, isn't that a nutty rule? We're just not going to enforce it. But it can mean winning and losing, but a proper referee or umpire is to enforce the rules as they are and not change them. And unfortunately, we have too many federal judges through the years who look at themselves as super legislators, and that's clearly not the way that the judicial branch was to be constituted. In fact, I state in my book that I think Mr. Jefferson had it right. In the beginning of our country, he said judges ought to be appointed for terms. He didn't win. Obviously, these federal judges are appointed for life. Who in the heck in society gets lifetime appointments? No one does. I mean, to have a 10-year contract is a long contract. And in Virginia, judges are appointed for terms. They're elected by the legislature or appointed by the governor. But those judges, whether the Supreme Court justices or district or circuit court or intermediate court judges, all have a term. And so there's at least that accountability. Most, I'd say 99% of them get reelected or reappointed, but there at least is that accountability to it. And I think at the federal level, these judges should not be appointed for life, but should be appointed for terms. So those are just some of the areas where I think the world of sports could give some insight into proper governance. As far as measurement, a way of measuring, very simple measurements of whether they're a government, particularly the federal government these days, is doing a good job, is two real simple measurements. What's the job growth or job decline? Just look at what are the job numbers. If they're doing a good job, if our tax laws are competitive internationally, you're going to get more investment, we'll get more jobs. If they're burdensome, we're going to keep losing jobs. The other measurement, in addition to jobs, should be the deficit. How big is the deficit in relationship to the economy? All of y'all who are fairly young are going to be loaded with a lot of dangerous levels of debt. The fact that the Chinese government owns more of our debt than do Americans is not a good vulnerable position to be in. And it's because the federal government is exceeding its authority. They're meddling in things that are none of their business. They should be left to the people or left to the states. And because of that, that growth, obviously there's more deficit spending, and that debt's going to have to get paid off. So the two measurements, I would say, are, is government doing a good job with their policies or not? Is, do we have job growth or not? And what's the size of the deficit as a proportion of our economy? And so there's an agenda. I have an agenda, but I'm going to focus on my book. If you have some questions on an agenda for America, a lot of it's in this book, but I do think it's very important that this Obamacare be stopped and defunded. They can also defund these czars, as far as I'm concerned as well. My goodness, we overthrew a British monarchy. The last thing we need to do is put a new monarchy on the north banks of the Potomac River. And so the other thing that I think needs to get done is we need to preserve the tax cuts that we passed back in 2001 and 2003, and prevent tax increases on income, on dividends, on capital gains, even on death. And tax increases are not going to help this country. It's going to hurt our country's competitiveness, and this is the last time to do it. And I also think we ought to withdraw authority of EPA to regulate CO2. That no one elected EPA to make those decisions on energy policy. Elected representatives should make that decision, not unelected bureaucrats. So those are my three prescriptions as an agenda for the future. So at any rate, I'll be happy to take some questions. I think this may be a way, a unique, different way, and maybe a fresh way for people to look at governance, folks like sports, see how those principles can help make our country a more competitive, more prosperous place for everyone to compete and succeed. So thank you all for having me. I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks.